I hope you're doing well. I want to talk with you briefly about this first slide again from Chapter 8 of Society in Focus, which is all about social inequality and social stratification. So as a brief review, just a few minutes, let's talk about these. Social inequality exists in all societies, but it is differently organized, if you will. So people in all societies have unequal access to three things: wealth, prestige, and power. And we'll talk more about how those are different depending on your social order. Social stratification is a little bit different as a term. You have structured inequality of categories of people. And I mentioned in class this is like stratified rock, if you will. Stratified rock is also always in a hierarchy from top to bottom. And social stratification means that individuals have different access to scarce but valued resources depending on where you fall within that system, that hierarchy. The main theorist you might recall I discussed was Max Weber, and he looked at three variables in particular for social class ranking. So sociologists are always looking at ways to measure things, and in order to measure social class ranking, he came up with three particular variables: the amount of wealth you have, which is really your total economic assets. But you can also look at power, which is the ability to realize your will in the face of resistance. And he also considered something called authority, which is legitimated power. So myself, for example, I have legitimated power because I have an advanced degree and a position within a university. So that gives me the ability to say, well, listen to what I have to say. Prestige, the third part, admiration that comes with your position. In class, I talked to you about how the status of firefighter went way up in terms of prestige that was given to that status, in large part after 9/11. They didn't even bother measuring whether or not people thought firefighters were prestigious until around 2003, and now it tops the list. And all three of these can vary. For example, if you're a teacher, you might have a lot of prestige within your community, but you may not have a lot of wealth. So that's why it's important to take multiple variables as a way of figuring out where social class is and how it exists. Also, these variables influence what are called your life chances. And we talked about these, that if you have higher social status in terms of social stratification, that's the SS, social stratification here. So if you benefit from social stratification, then you likely have higher quality health care, better education, you're more likely to stay married, and live a longer life, which I will discuss more in the next slide. To see, but I'll describe it to you, and you can use your little magnifying glass to zoom in and perhaps read along if you can. But it's from the New York Times only about 3 years ago, and it says poverty reaches a 52-year peak. So why is it important to study social inequality? Because it changes, and because it has dramatic effects on people, of course, within a society. And this is arguing, it says the second headline, median income falls, and it says in the content of the article, another 2.6 million people slipped into poverty in the US last year, the Census Bureau reported Tuesday. So sociologists get hired by the Census Bureau to measure and track these changes as important indications of our national health and well-being, if you will. It says here, this was the first time since the Great Depression that the median American household has lower income, adjusted for inflation, than 13 years earlier. This is the fourth full paragraph. This is truly a lost decade, Professor Katz said. We think of America as a place where every generation is doing better, but we're looking at a period where the median family is in worse shape than in the 1980s. I'm sorry, the 1990s. So this speaks directly to that concept we discussed the idea of a meritocracy, the belief that in America you can do well if you work hard. And America is supposed to be a place that's unique in that regard. No other country in the world allows for the opportunities like we have in America for an individual to decide whether they want to do well or not. In Europe, you are often placed in a position that you couldn't change very easily. So people have come around the world to the United States in search of the American dream. And the question is, with articles like these, is this still a place where the American dream is possible? And it's an open question. Four different types of stratification systems I'd like you to know about, and I'd like you to know how they exist in comparison with each other. I'll try to show that to you now. One of the most basic stratification system is a two-strata system. You've got slavery with free people and slaves. And this was a very common system at various points in time during the human experience. Even in our continent, we've had over 150 years of this type of system in our historic timeline, and it is by no means gone. There are still people who are enslaved around the world, and so this, even though it seems like a sort of simple thing and doesn't take a lot of thought, it's a very important aspect of social stratification historically and also in contemporary worldwide politics through things like, for example, sex trafficking. Caste systems. These I'd like you to know of as closed systems. Now, what does that mean? They're closed in terms of opportunity structure and ability to move from one caste to another. So these are going to be useful to contrast against social class, which are open systems, where you can move up or down depending on your effort and the way things go in your life. But caste systems are based on ascribed status, and we've talked about this before. Ascribed status means a status that's written on you. So, for example, your race, your sex, your age, these are things you can't change. In India, caste systems used to traditionally dominated. They've been made illegal now, but they still exist and they still have a lot of force, especially in rural parts of India. So you are born into a particular caste in India. Here are some of the castes that they mention. The Brahmins, who are priests and scholars, the Kshatriyas, who are warriors and warriors and royalty, he said. The Vaisyas, merchants, and the Sudras, peasants and craft workers. And the Harijans are called untouchables. They are part of the caste system, and in the past I've shown videos about the untouchables, and what's horrible is that they're permanently stuck in a position where they inherit their jobs from their parents, and they're the worst jobs. For example, dealing with the dead, dealing with human waste. So you would be able to see these videos if you Google untouchables caste system into, for example, YouTube. Videos of people who are stuck in these awful jobs for their entire life, and they suffer illness and other kinds of physical problems, shorter lifespans because of that. So those are inherited positions. The people who are born into that caste stay in that caste. There are also very explicit rules about social contact. Members of the lowest caste, the untouchables, are having to do certain types of things which other castes do not. For example, untouchables have their own wells, and they're not allowed to use the wells of higher caste members. Those people feel they may be polluted if an untouchable uses their well water. In one video you might be able to find on YouTube, untouchables have to use a different part of the lake that is used by other caste members. Also, too, if a higher caste member encounters a lower caste member, then they have to go through ritual bathing and purification to remove the stigma that caste member has imparted on them. And as I have here, the big example from your textbook is India, and as I said, it's illegal now, but it still has a lot of teeth and is very prominent still in rural areas in terms of how people interact. Estate systems, those are another type of social stratification, and these dominated during the traditional period we talked about, pre-1700, when Europe had a feudal society. And so in feudal society, you had three different estates: the priesthood, the nobility, and commoners. And what happened in feudalism is you were in a particular estate, and that meant that you pretty much stayed there. The idea with this is that you couldn't buy or sell land. The only people who could possess land were the elites, the nobility. And so that makes this system very different from a capitalist system. In capitalism, people can buy and sell land, and in capitalism, you can move up or down in your social status. So the estate system preceded the social class system that we now take for granted in Western societies. Finally, that social class system I mentioned is an open system, which means that instead of it being based on ascribed status, class is about what you achieve, what you do. Again, America is supposed to be a meritocracy where you can get ahead based on your work. Also, too, it's perfectly legal for you to associate with members of a different social class. You can hang out, talk. You don't have to do ritual bathing. It's not forbidden. You can drink out of the same well. And so this is important because it allows people to have more contact. No formal proscriptions, as I have here on the overhead. So social class are open systems. Caste, though, by comparison, closed systems. Consider socioeconomic status. Sometimes sociologists abbreviate this as SES. And again, sociologists like to look at variables that can be measured. And so, as an example, socioeconomic status can include a person's income, the type of job or career that they have, their level of education, and sometimes it can also include the neighborhood in which a person lives. Because as we all know, property taxes differ depending on where you live and, of course, the quality of the housing you have. And so there are classes in the United States and very different socioeconomic status. I want to talk with you very briefly about the information in your text on classes in the US. I'm not going to ask you questions about the specific characteristics of each one in any depth, but there are a few things I'd like you to note. The first thing that is important is with the upper class, this is a group that only makes up about 5% of the US population, but accounts for over 20% of the total income. It's rather amazing how much control the very, very upper class has of total income in the United States. The middle class is seen as professionals, physicians, white-collar employees. But it's hard for sociologists to get a particular anchor on what counts as a middle-class person. Some people would say that middle-class income might stop or be capped at, say, $80,000. Some people might put it lower. Others, though, have said that you're middle class if you are a couple that earns less than, say, $250,000 a year. So the reason I don't want you to necessarily know all the details of this discussion in your text is because what counts as your class depends on how you define it. What's your operational definition? I suspect that a lot of you would say that you are middle class, and that's your self-identification. That's another way of measuring these things. But last points that I'll make about class. The working class, it says, are generally people who make under $50,000 a year and can include what are called blue-collar workers, people who do service-style work often, truck drivers, people who do labor, factory work. One very important trend in the last several years is that the middle class seems to be shrinking in the United States. And as it's been shrinking, there are more people in poverty, and the amount of concentrated wealth at the very top is growing at a very strong rate. Okay. So this is the main stuff I'd like you to know. As far as a few other terms, on page 212, absolute poverty is a concept that you can contrast against relative poverty. Absolute means that there's a set standard, and that standard is a minimum subsistence level. So life-threatening poverty. Okay, if you have trouble finding a place to sleep or getting things to eat, nutritional food, you're in absolute poverty. You can contrast this, though, against relative poverty, which is another way of measuring poverty. Maybe you're poor compared to others in your group. So, for example, somebody who is, I don't know, an executive at a corporation may be relatively poor compared to all the other executives across the nation who are in that cohort. Okay, so these are different ideas about how you can operationalize what counts as poverty. The feminization of poverty I'll talk about in a future slide. And so before moving on, I want to show you in some ways how poverty can affect all those things I mentioned before, like health, for example. And then I'll talk a little more about this slide in a minute. From 2014, which is titled Income Gap, Meet the Longevity Gap. And this again reinforces the idea that your life chances are strongly affected by your position in the system of social stratification. So if you can zoom in on this, it says Fairfax County and McDowell County are both in the West Virginia area, separated by only 350 miles. However, it says the two countries are very different because in Fairfax County, the income, if I have this area right here, is around $107,000. This is a very high income. But McDowell County has very little in the way of industry. Unemployment is rampant, drug use is rampant, and that median income that they mention here is about 1/5 of the 107,000 from that nearby Fairfax County. So what does that translate into? Here's the fallout. It says life expectancies are different in these. Fairfax County, people live a long period of time, 82 years for men, 85 for women, which is about the same rate as Sweden, a very advanced industrial nation. By contrast, it says here, in McDowell County, the average ages for men, 64, average lifespan for women, 73. And those numbers are about the same as you'd have in Iraq. So these income differences and status differences have real effects on people's physical, biological lives, the way people's lives play out. previous slide, we've talked about absolute and relative poverty as different ways of operationalizing poverty. Feminization of poverty is an increasingly important area, and what it refers to is the disproportionate number of women in the world who are poor. And there are several reasons for this. One of them you can think about, for example, might relate to divorce. If you're thinking about men and women who divorce, who typically gets custody of children? Women usually do. And studies have found that men's income usually goes up after they divorce. And I'll be showing you an article on that after I'm done talking about this slide. Also, too, when women get custody of children, they have to supervise those children, and they have less of an ability to work. So women are at an economic disadvantage vis-a-vis men, often, especially when there's a divorce. Women get paid less than men do, as many studies have shown. And around the world, women in traditional societies especially have less access to educational systems. So this is a big, big issue, and if you want to improve the status of women worldwide, and really as a feminist, you would want to argue for increasing access of women to education, because all the studies say that education allows for better development of skills, better employment, and also educated women are more likely to delay marriage and childbirth, which allows them to accumulate more property and be better prepared for those. We've done an entire book, or will by the end of the semester, on homelessness, and so I don't need to go into this, I think, in too much depth. But if you want to see the main causes of homelessness talked about in your text, some of them parallel what I've discussed. Institutionalization was prominent of mentally ill people pre-1950, and then we talked about the deinstitutionalization movement, which means mental institutions were closed. In the 1960s, you saw the rise of psychotropic drugs, which are used to address the symptoms of mental illness. They don't cure mental illness. And then also, too, you see community mental health centers being adopted as the way to deal with those people who have mental health issues, but they're underfunded. And so we have more people on the streets who are mentally ill today because of these trends related to deinstitutionalization. We've shifted away from a manufacturing economy. In places like Detroit, for example, people with a high school diploma could have a very good job and work their whole lives and support a family and have a home of their own. These days, those jobs have often been outsourced abroad to other countries where the labor is cheaper. And as an example, we talked about the shirts that we have in class that we were all wearing, many of which come from countries where labor is far cheaper. So that means people get paid less, more potential for homelessness. There's also a lack of housing accessible to homeless people in urban areas. Urban areas are, of course, very popular places for people to live now, but they're also very expensive. And the services in cities are also expensive. Groceries cost more money, your taxes are higher. All of these things work together to exclude some people, lower income people, from being able to afford life in those cities. Cities like Manhattan, for example, are astronomically expensive for people to live in. You may pay $5,000 a month for an apartment. So expensive big cities. Oscar Lewis's argument, we can discuss for a minute, the culture of poverty, argues that poverty isn't just about structural things, like, for example, opportunity. He's arguing that poverty can be passed down from one generation to another or one group to another by people saying, well, we don't have the possibility of getting out of this. So being apathetic means not caring. Being cynical about life chances, saying, oh, well, homeless people can't get out of homelessness. And I had one person in my study say, the shelters just give you the runaround. They don't really help you. So that's cynical. and it's also showing a distrust of social institutions. So Lewis said that poor people may be to blame for their poverty because of their own norms, values, and beliefs that they pass on. In some other circles, though, people might say, well, you're really blaming poor people for their poverty if you take on this approach. So it's a different way of thinking about poverty and what causes it. There's been some work by people, for example, who've created schools in Harlem. One school is called the Harlem Children's Zone, which has tried to take children and their parents out of what Lewis would call the culture of poverty by making the children in these schools in Harlem spend many hours a day in school, over 8 hours, I think, and then having the parents help them with their homework for an extended period of time to break what you could call the culture of poverty. Social mobility, mobility is always movement, and so you can have horizontal and vertical social mobility. Horizontal I think of as a horizon. So for example, if I were to go from being a professor to being a white-collar manager, that might be horizontal mobility, from one job to another like job, for example. Vertical means you'd go from, say, working at McDonald's to a white-collar position, okay, up and down. Intra-generational means within one generation. So Sam Walton moved from having a lower class to being one of the richest people in the United States within his lifetime. That's intra-generational mobility. Intergenerational mobility means, say for example, a parent is poor but a child does well. That's intergenerational mobility. You can zoom in on, and it makes the point I made in the previous slide. Men become richer after divorce. This is out of the UK, United Kingdom newspaper, The Guardian. But these findings are also true in America as well, just not the specifics that they make in points of in this article. It says divorce makes men, and particularly fathers, significantly richer. When a father separates from the mother of his children, according to new research, his available income increases by around 1/3. Women, by contrast, suffer severe financial penalties. Here it is in the fourth full paragraph. The general belief that men get fleeced by their divorces while women get richer and live off the proceeds has long been due for exposure as a pernicious myth. That means a lie that people keep alive. It says here, in reality, women often suffer economic hardship and unfair financial settlements and damaging ongoing relationships with former spouses. So all in all, again, this is part and parcel of the feminization of poverty. Is concerned with the sociological approaches to social inequality. And there are different perspectives within functionalism, conflict theory, and the symbolic interactionist perspective as to how social inequality plays out and what its purposes are. All right. So let's go through functionalism. And again, you might remember the metaphor that society is like an organism. Different parts work together for the whole thing to function. So the guys responsible for this, Kingsley Davis and Wilbur E. Moore, they argue that stratification is going to motivate people to perform what are called socially useful tasks. All right. So this is supposed to be, according to Davis and Moore, based on filling the needs of society. That social stratification is good because people will then do the things they need to do, and then they'll be rewarded for those things. Now, if you were to think critically about this for a minute, can you think of any jobs where people are paid very well, but they're not necessarily doing something socially important? Maybe you have one in mind. Can you also think about jobs which are people doing something very socially important, but they're not paid very well. Okay, so these are examples that are showing that Davis and Moore's idea is not necessarily a very good one. Actors, for example, make a lot of money. Do they contribute socially? Meh, yeah, somewhat. Teachers, you could argue, are very important, but they don't get paid anywhere near as much as perhaps they ought to be. So Davis and Moore's theory has some problems, you could say. The interactionist perspective is very interesting and something that we could talk about as a term, conspicuous consumption, which is by Thorsten Veblen. And this basically is purchasing and displaying goods and services to indicate some kind of status or disposable income. And I talked about this with you before when I drew my very bad picture of the two different car symbols. Actually, this is going really well this time. All right, see if I can pull this one off. So on the one hand, you have that car. Wow, that's actually looking really sharp. Well, it did look sharp. Okay, and then this car. This was the Mercedes. This is the Chevy. And you know these symbols, and they're important for people saying, hey, I've got money to burn. Conspicuous consumption is a huge thing because these days people want to show their wealth and indicate it sometimes in very subtle ways. There's this notion that people who are really rich know the different kinds of cuts of suits, for example, and can tell those things. Also, too, you see the rise of people trying to impersonate well-to-do people through knockoff products, and you've all got some familiarity with those. My mom once bought a watch when she was traveling abroad from some people on a street corner. They sold it to her for $10, and she took it into a jeweler in the United States, and even though they told her it was a Rolex, the fellow said, oh, I know your watch is a knockoff because when I look at it through the lens here, I can see it says Olex instead of Rolex. So we like to try to gain status through products as well these days. But they're the marker of social class and social inequality. Finally, the conflict perspective, the bourgeoisie we've talked about as owners of the means of production, the proletariat work for them. And Marx argued that that system of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat was based on competitive capitalism, where today we have more monopoly capitalism. So monopoly capitalism is large multinational corporations taking over for what were once mom and pop style businesses. And those multinationals have increased phenomenally in number since the 1600s. I have a chart which I wasn't able to reproduce for you, but if I can find it here for a second. It shows that in 1600 there were only 500 multinational corporations in the world. Today, 60,000 multinational corporations. Names that you know very well: Coca-Cola, R.J. Reynolds, AT&T, Disney, Motorola, McDonald's, Sony. So what's happening is power, wealth are concentrating in fewer and fewer hands and fewer companies, which leads to potential problems. What happens when the companies, the corporations consolidate so much that laborers have no choice but to work for only a few that compete with each other and may not have much of a chance to negotiate wages or benefits or other things like this. So the future and social inequality is important to think about, and sociologists spend a lot of time on that. Thank you.